Welcome to this information session for Class B Cemetery Trusts on the commencement of the new Cemeteries and Crematoria Regulations 2025. This is presented to you by the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Team at the Department of Health, Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting and wherever you are tuning into this presentation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Today we will present an overview of the key amendments in the 2025 regulations and discuss how you can implement the changes. As we progress through the session, you can post any queries or comments into the chat and we'll endeavour to respond in writing as we go or address your queries at the end of the session when we have time set aside for questions. If you'd like a copy of this slide presentation with recorded audio, or if you have any other questions about the new regulations, you can email us at any time. Our contact details will be provided on the last slide. Over the last 12 months, the Department conducted an extensive review of the old 2015 regulations and consulted with cemetery trusts, other parts of the sector, the public, and relevant government agencies. Many of you attended a webinar in January and provided valuable feedback to our discussion paper in February. Your input helped us to develop the new regulations, which were approved by the Governor and Council on the 11th of June 2025 and came into effect on the 16th of June 2025. These regulations will remain in force until they expire in 10 years from the day of their making on the 11th of June 2035. Over the next 6 slides, we'll summarise the key changes in the new regulations for you to be aware of. Please note that this is an overview only. More detail is in the new regulations themselves and in the supporting documents that we'll discuss shortly. The first category of changes are administrative or clarifying amendments. These include several new definitions. For example, sealed cap has been introduced to simplify the provisions dealing with burial requirements. Sealed cap is defined as a substantial layer of concrete or similar solid material, which means that crushed rock would not be considered compliant. Container reference number has been added for when organisations like tissue banks and schools of anatomy seek authorisation to cremate body parts from more than one person in a container with a reference number. Nearest surviving relative has been updated to use gender-neutral language. For example, son or daughter has been replaced with child. Animal has now been defined to exclude assistance animals from the restrictions that apply to other kinds of animals in cemeteries. Changes have also been made to resolve confusion identified during consultation about the different requirements for bodily remains, body parts, and fetal remains. In the 2015 regulations, these were sometimes dealt with separately and sometimes collectively under the term human remains. For greater clarity, the requirements for bodily remains, body parts, and fetal remains are now set out in separate provisions and separate forms. Structural changes have been made to improve consistency by grouping related provisions together. For example, the regulations now consolidate the requirements and obligations that cemetery trusts must meet, along with the powers for cemetery trusts to control what happens inside cemeteries. The model rules now consolidate offences, penalties, and restrictions related to activities that occur within cemeteries. Prescribed information. Regulations 6 to 20 form Part 2 of the regulations, which sets out the prescribed information for cemetery trust records. This is information about interments, places of interment, cremations, and rites of interment that cemetery trusts must record and keep. Under Section 60 of the Cemeteries and Crematoria Act 2003, cemetery trusts must make this information available to anyone who asks for it for historical or research purposes. For this reason, it's important that the prescribed information does not include personal or private information related to living people. This is why some amendments have been made to the prescribed information in the 2025 regulations, such as replacing full address with the suburb, town or city, or removing address-related data altogether. For example, the prescribed information for interment of bodily remains used to include the last known address of the deceased. Under the old regulations, someone could ask a trust for this information, which could compromise the privacy of any living people connected to the deceased who were still living at that address. Under new Regulation 6, only the suburb, town or city of the last known address of the deceased is prescribed information that can be given to a person who requests it. As a second example, under the old regulations, the prescribed information for rights of interment included the full name, address and contact number of the holder of the right of interment. All of this information could then be requested from a trust by any person. In the new regulations, the address and contact number have been removed. If someone asks you for information about a right of interment holder, you can only share their name. Trusts may still gather personal information like full addresses and contact numbers for operational purposes. This is why those fields remain in the new forms. However, this information is for internal use only. If someone asks you for information about interments, places of interment, cremations, and rights of interment, you should carefully check Part 2 of the regulations to see what information is prescribed and can be shared. The new regulations now include 11 prescribed forms, each with a clear single purpose. For example, applications relating to interment and cremation of bodily remains, body parts, and fetal remains are now in separate forms. Of the 11 prescribed forms, there are only 3 that are likely to be received by most Class B cemetery trusts. The most commonly received form will be Form 1, the application for interment of bodily remains. This form is largely the same as the old Form 1, with minor changes to the layout and checkbox options, and clarification that consent must be obtained from all right of interment holders if there is more than one. It also now asks for the relationship of the applicant and right of interment holders to the deceased. This is intended to assist cemetery trusts locate right of interment holders in future. A new question also asks if the deceased was a veteran. This information is intended to help trusts with the identification and management of veterans' interment sites. On rare occasions, you may receive Form 3, the application to inter body parts. For example, this could be because a person wishes to inter their own body part, such as an amputated limb, in a place of interment they have pre-purchased with the intention that after their death, the rest of their remains will be buried there. Another scenario is that the family of a deceased person may wish to reunite body parts that have been held by the coroner with the deceased's remains that have already been interred. In these instances, the name of the person the body parts belong to would be known. You may also occasionally receive Form 4, the application to inter fetal remains. This form is complemented by amendments to prescribed persons in Regulation 21, which now includes the person who was pregnant with the fetus. This will allow that person to directly apply to inter the fetal remains in a public cemetery without needing a registered medical practitioner to complete the application on their behalf, as was the case under the old regulations. These amendments are intended to simplify the application process to ease the administrative burden on families during a distressing time. 2 other forms likely to be received by cemetery trusts are existing Form A, the application for a right of interment, and Form B, the application to inter cremated human remains. These are not prescribed forms, so they do not appear in the new regulations. However, the Department plans to update Forms A and B to match the style and format of the new prescribed forms and to introduce a question about veteran status into Form B. In the meantime, existing Forms A and B are still available on the Department's website to help cemetery trusts manage these applications efficiently. The remaining forms in the new regulations will not be commonly received by Class B cemetery trusts. This slide gives an overview of these forms and their intended purpose. Form 2 is only used for applications to inter in private cemeteries, so Class B trusts will not receive this form. Applicants submit Form 2 directly to the Department to seek approval from the Secretary. Forms 5, 6, 7 and 8 are all related to applications for cremation, so only cemetery trusts with a crematorium will receive these. Again, they are designed for a clear single purpose, so there is no confusion about which form is required for cremation of bodily remains, body parts and fetal remains. Forms 9 and 10 are designed to be used by a small number of organisations like tissue banks, schools of anatomy, museums, hospitals, and the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. Form 9 is for applications to cremate bodily remains with an identifier if the name of the deceased is unknown. For example, a donor cadaver sourced from overseas by a school of anatomy, an unidentified body released for disposal by the coroner, or a historical skeleton from a museum. Form 10 is for applications to cremate body parts or tissue from multiple people inside a container with a reference number. This could occur when a tissue bank wishes to cremate unused body parts such as heart valves from multiple donors, or if a hospital wishes to cremate body parts from multiple people, or if a museum wishes to cremate bones or specimens of unknown provenance. Finally, Form 11 is used to apply for an exhumation licence. It is completed by members of the public or a funeral director acting on their behalf and submitted to the Department so the Secretary can decide whether to grant an exhumation licence. Applicants or funeral directors may pass the completed Form 11 on to a Class B cemetery trust along with the approval from the Secretary to help the trust prepare for the exhumation. As noted earlier in this presentation, most of the forms still collect personal information about the deceased, the applicant, or the right of interment holder. This information is for operational purposes only. Trusts cannot share information such as full address with anyone outside the trust. The only information that can be shared is the prescribed information in Regulations 6 to 20 as discussed earlier. Please note that if you want to share a completed form with a person who requests information under Section 60 of the Act, you can only do this if you first redact all information that isn't prescribed under Regulations 6 to 20. Technical and operational amendments. The new regulations now include a requirement that coffins, containers and receptacles for interment or cremation of bodily remains, body parts and fetal remains must be clearly labelled. The label must display the name of the person, or an identifier if the person's identity is unknown, or a container reference number if the vessel holds body parts from more than one person. This amendment formalises common practice and is intended to help the cemetery trusts with identification checks upon arrival at the cemetery and if an exhumation occurs in the future. There has also been a change to the soil depth requirement between a sealed grave and ground level. It has been reduced from 500 mm to 400 mm. This will enable cemetery trusts to accommodate multiple interments more easily while maintaining safety requirements. This is a minimum depth only. Trusts may use a greater depth at their discretion, for example, if they have concerns about entry by vermin or the effects of weather and erosion. The soil depth in an unsealed grave is unchanged at 750 millimetres. Restrictions on conduct and activities in public cemeteries have been retained, clarified or enhanced in the new regulations and model rules. The restrictions apply to memorialisation on or around places of interment, the use of fire, the use of vehicles, entry and control of animals, causing a disturbance, decorating, pruning and damaging plants, digging and constructing, and engaging in activities like sport, swimming, bathing, hunting and camping. Cemetery trusts may still give directions about how a funeral is conducted and about the adornment of places of interment. A person who's given a direction by a cemetery trust is required to comply under the regulations. Removal powers have been retained that allow trusts to remove objects or things that are non-compliant, in poor condition, or extend beyond the boundary of places of interment. In addition, Regulation 56 now explicitly allows trusts to remove items that may cause danger to any person or property. A significant change in the new regulations is that cemetery trusts may now give broad approval in advance for certain activities to occur in their cemetery via policies published on their website or displayed in signage on site. Previously, individuals could apply to a trust for approval to conduct activities that were otherwise prohibited in the regulations, and cemetery trusts were able to give individual written approvals to these applicants. Now, if a trust considers certain activities may be safely conducted in their cemetery without causing undue disturbance, it may publish general pre-approval for anyone to engage in these activities. A trust may also pre-approve activities with conditions or limitations. For example, that specific adornment practices or sporting activities may be permitted at certain times of year or in designated areas of the cemetery grounds or for specified durations. These policies will improve efficiency for trusts and bring transparency and certainty for the public about what is permitted in the cemetery. For more information about the new regulations, we encourage you to visit the Cemeteries and Crematoria page on the Department of Health website. The address will be provided at the end of this presentation. Support material on the website includes a summary of review outcomes. This document gives more detail about the review process leading up to the making of the new regulations, including the consultation process, stakeholder feedback to the discussion paper, and the rationale for amendments that have been made. There is also a fact sheet for cemetery trusts with a detailed appendix. This document lists all the changes to each regulation, form, and model rule. It includes alert symbols to draw your attention to the most important things you need to know, and it gives guidance on actions you should take to implement the new requirements. This document is the main guidance resource for cemetery trusts to understand and implement the new regulations. On the website, you will also find Word templates of the 11 forms. These forms can be downloaded and filled electronically, or they can be printed out and completed by hand. As mentioned earlier, the most relevant form for Class B trusts is still Form 1, the application for interment authorisation for bodily remains. You should also continue to use Form A for applications for rights of interment and Form B for applications to inter cremated remains. If you are unclear about which forms to use on which occasion, or if you need additional time to implement the new forms, please contact the department. There are several things cemetery trusts can do now to implement the new regulations. First, you should download the new regulations from the Victorian Legislation website so you can see what's changed. To help identify and understand the changes, download the fact sheet from the department's website. Consider all the restrictions on conduct and activities in the regulations and model rules, and think about whether any of these prohibited activities could safely occur in your cemetery. If you identify any activities that could occur without causing safety risks or undue disturbance, you should develop a policy stating that these activities may be conducted in your cemetery without prior written approval from the Trust. For example, if your fire risk is low, your policy could permit candles, incense, or joss sticks to be lit, or smoking ceremonies to be conducted at any time except on fire ban days without prior Trust approval. If you want to permit some activities with conditions or limitations, these should also be documented in your policies. For example, your policy could permit certain forms of adornment during cultural festive periods, or your policy could allow for certain sports to be played in designated areas of the cemetery or at certain times. When you have developed your policies, you should publish them on your website if you have one and display them prominently on site. You must also make your policy available to anyone on request. Your policy cannot be implemented or be effective in controlling activities that occur in your cemetery unless the public knows about them. Your policies should also set out your processes for dealing with breaches. For example, if adornments are not removed after the period specified in your policy, you should explain if and how you would remove them, store them, or dispose of them, and how you would notify the public. For example, by contacting right of interment holders, or putting up notices on site, or publishing your intentions in the local newspaper. Another step you can take now is to start using the new forms. This may require you to inform local funeral directors and your community about the new forms if they have not seen the department's announcements. Finally, you should continue to comply with unchanged regulatory requirements and support the broader community to do the same. If you have not already done so, we encourage you to visit the Cemeteries and Crematoria page on the Department of Health website, where you will find the resources discussed throughout this presentation. You can also send queries about the new regulations to the Legislative and Regulatory Reform team using the contact details on this slide.